What happened to the bodies of the Challenger disaster crew? 73 seconds. That's all it took for the world to change. But here's what almost nobody knows. The 7 astronauts aboard Challenger did not die in that fireball everyone remembers. They lived for nearly 3 more minutes after the explosion the entire planet watched on live television. And what happened to them, and to their bodies, in the weeks that followed is a story NASA never hid, but rarely told. Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you will understand a tragedy you thought you already knew. Let's start with something that needs to be said clearly before we go any further. This story involves real people who died, and real families who grieved them, some of whom are still alive today. Nothing here is meant to sensationalize their deaths. NASA's decision to keep certain details away from public cameras in 1986 was not an attempt to deceive anyone. It was an act of mercy, a choice to protect grieving families from having their most private pain turned into a public spectacle. We're going to walk through this carefully, sticking only to what investigators, engineers, and medical examiners actually confirmed. Where the evidence is uncertain, we'll say so. On the morning of January 28, 1986, 7 people boarded the Space Shuttle Challenger at Kennedy Space Center in Florida. Commander Francis Dick Scobie was a former Air Force test pilot with a reputation for calm, steady leadership. Beside him sat pilot Michael Smith, a decorated Navy aviator flying his very first mission into space. Behind them were the mission specialists, Judith Resnick, an electrical engineer and only the second American woman ever to fly in orbit, Ellison Onizuka, an aerospace engineer from Hawaii and the first person of Japanese descent to reach space, and Ronald McNair, a physicist who had grown up in the segregated American South and gone on to earn a doctorate from MIT. Rounding out the crew were 2 payload specialists, Gregory Jarvis, an engineer who had been bumped from earlier missions and was finally getting his flight, and Krista McAuliffe, a social studies teacher from Concord, New Hampshire, selected from more than 11,000 applicants to become the first private citizen to fly aboard the shuttle. Because McAuliffe planned to teach lessons from orbit, schools across the country had arranged special broadcasts so students could watch their teacher launch into space. That single detail is why so many children ended up witnessing what happened next. The night before launch had been unusually cold for Florida, with temperatures dropping into the 20s and 30s overnight. Ice coated the launch tower, and engineers at Morton Thiokol, the company that built the shuttle's solid rocket boosters, raised serious concerns about launching in such conditions. Their data suggested the rubber O-ring seals in the booster joints might not function properly in the cold. Those warnings were overruled. The mission had already been delayed several times, and there was mounting pressure, institutional, political, and public, to finally get Challenger off the ground. At 11:38 a.m., it launched. For just over a minute, the flight looked completely normal. Then, 73 seconds after liftoff, at an altitude of roughly 48,000 feet, a plume of flame escaped from a joint in the right solid rocket booster. It burned through a strut and then into the shuttle's massive external fuel tank. What the world saw next, that enormous cloud of fire and white smoke, was not the crew being killed. It was the fuel tank rupturing and its propellants igniting around the vehicle. The orbiter itself was not blown apart by an explosion in the way most people assume. It was torn apart by aerodynamic forces as the structure failed while traveling at nearly twice the speed of sound. The wings, the engines, the fuselage, all of it broke into thousands of pieces scattered across the sky. But here is the detail that changes everything about how we should understand this event. The crew compartment, the reinforced section at the front of the orbiter where all 7 astronauts were seated, did not shatter along with the rest of the vehicle. According to the Rogers Commission, the presidential panel that investigated the disaster, the crew cabin separated from the disintegrating orbiter largely in one piece. Trailing wires and cables that tore loose during the breakup are believed to have acted almost like a tail, keeping the cabin somewhat stabilized rather than tumbling freely as it fell. Because the shuttle was still climbing at the moment of breakup, the detached cabin kept rising on its own momentum for several more seconds before gravity finally won. Investigators estimated it reached a peak altitude of around 65,000 feet, well above the cruising altitude of a commercial airliner, before beginning its descent toward the Atlantic Ocean below. From that high point, the fall lasted an estimated 2 minutes and 45 seconds. Try to picture how long that actually is. Long enough to listen to most of a song. Long enough to read several pages of a book. That is how long 7 people were inside a falling, sealed metal compartment with no engine, no parachute, and, by design, no way to survive what was coming. This is worth pausing on because it surprises almost everyone who learns it. The space shuttle was never built with an escape system for the full crew during ascent. There were no ejection seats for all 7 astronauts, no separable crew capsule with parachutes, no system engineered to bring the cabin down safely in the event of a catastrophic failure at that speed and altitude. NASA's design assumed that a breakup during ascent, if it ever happened, would not be survivable, so no rescue mechanism existed for the scenario that actually unfolded. When the cabin eventually struck the ocean surface, investigators calculated it was traveling at more than 200 miles per hour. At that speed, water does not cushion an impact. It behaves almost like solid ground. Here is what the evidence tells us about those final minutes, and it deserves to be handled honestly rather than dramatized. Dr. Joseph Kerwin, a physician and former astronaut who led NASA's medical investigation, concluded that the forces experienced during the initial breakup were not by themselves lethal and were in a range the human body could plausibly survive. What remained uncertain, and remains uncertain to this day, is whether the crew cabin lost pressure during the fall, and if so, how quickly. If the compartment depressurized rapidly at high altitude, the crew would likely have lost consciousness within seconds due to lack of oxygen. If it depressurized more slowly, or not completely, some crew members may have remained conscious and aware for longer. Kerwin's official report described the evidence as inconclusive on this specific point, and researchers who have revisited the data over the years have continued to debate exactly how much the astronauts knew and for how long. What is not in dispute is this. Recovered wreckage included 4 personal emergency air packs, devices designed to give astronauts breathable air during ground emergencies, not survival equipment for a fall from the upper atmosphere. Investigators found that several of these packs had been switched on. Those switches do not activate on their own. Someone had to physically reach over and turn them on. This single piece of physical evidence is widely regarded as the strongest indication that at least some crew members were alive and capable of purposeful action in the moments immediately following the breakup, whether from full awareness or a trained, almost instinctive reflex to reach for oxygen the instant something felt wrong. It does not tell us how long that awareness lasted, and it does not answer every question about what the crew experienced. But it is real, documented evidence, not speculation, and it is part of why NASA's own investigators concluded the astronauts' deaths were not instantaneous in the way the public had assumed. When the cabin struck the ocean, the impact was, in the words of the medical investigation, the cause of death for the crew. Whatever had or hadn't happened to their consciousness during the fall, the final impact was catastrophic and immediate. NASA's official position, based on Kerwin's report, was that the exact moment and cause of death for each individual crew member could not be determined with certainty given the condition of the wreckage, but that the impact with the water was almost certainly fatal instantly for anyone who had not already lost consciousness beforehand. Now, let's talk about what happened on the ground and in the water, because the recovery effort itself is a story that deserves far more attention than it usually gets. In the first hours after the breakup, nobody in mission control or at the launch site fully understood what we've just described. Telemetry data from the shuttle simply went silent. Flight controllers watched the smoke trails split apart into 2 distinct, corkscrewing paths as the solid rocket boosters, now free of the vehicle, tumbled off in different directions. A voice on the mission control loop delivered one of the most quietly haunting lines in spaceflight history, stating simply that the vehicle had experienced, in his words, a major malfunction. It was the measured language of a professional trying to hold steady in real time while the truth was still sinking in. Out at the viewing areas, many spectators who had never watched a launch before did not immediately grasp what they were seeing. Some kept cheering for several seconds after the breakup, assuming the branching smoke trails were simply part of the normal booster separation. In classrooms across the United States, where television sets had been wheeled in specifically so students could watch their teacher fly into space. Children watched the same footage without understanding what they were witnessing, while many of their teachers stood frozen, unsure how to explain what had just happened. The Coast Guard and Navy launched an immediate search and rescue operation, sending aircraft and vessels to the debris field roughly 18 miles off the Florida coast. For those first hours, it was officially a rescue mission because protocol required treating every possibility as open until proven otherwise. But those familiar with the shuttle's design understood almost immediately that there had been no survivable way out of what had occurred. By the end of that first day, the operation's language shifted from rescue to recovery, a word that carries no promise of a miracle, only the commitment to bring everyone home. What followed was one of the largest and most difficult search operations NASA had ever conducted. Debris from the shuttle was scattered across hundreds of square miles of ocean, ranging from tiny fragments of insulation to massive sections of the orbiter's structure resting on the seafloor. Ships equipped with sonar systematically combed the search grid, while divers were sent down whenever sonar detected an object that didn't match the natural contours of the ocean floor. The work was slow, physically punishing, and psychologically heavy. Divers spent weeks in cold, often murky water, examining a debris field that included both twisted machinery and, eventually, human remains. Many of the divers and searchers involved in that operation rarely spoke publicly about it afterward. The single most important target of the search was the crew cabin itself, both because it was the largest largely intact structure remaining and because it was where the astronauts had been. Investigators used data on ocean currents, debris dispersal patterns, and the shuttle's trajectory to narrow down where the cabin was most likely to have settled. On March 7, 1986, more than 5 weeks after the launch, sonar operators detected a large object on the seafloor roughly 18 miles northeast of the launch site, in about 100 feet of water. Divers confirmed it was the crew cabin. What happened next reflects the same instinct for discretion that had shaped NASA's handling of the tragedy from the beginning. A secure perimeter was established around the recovery site, and press aircraft were kept far enough away that no footage of the actual recovery could be captured. The remains of all 7 crew members were recovered from the cabin, brought to a secure facility, and identified using dental records and other forensic methods available at the time. Families were notified privately before any information reached the public. This was not an attempt to hide the truth from the country. It was a deliberate choice to let 7 families learn devastating news privately, rather than watching it unfold live on television the way the initial disaster had. In the months and years that followed, the Rogers Commission's investigation confirmed that the failure originated in an O-ring seal on the right solid rocket booster, which had hardened and lost its ability to seal properly in the unusually cold temperatures that morning. The Commission's report went further than identifying a single mechanical cause. It also documented a broader pattern of organizational failure at NASA, including a culture where warning signs about the O-ring design had been raised by engineers years earlier and repeatedly set aside as launch schedules took priority. The 7 crew members were laid to rest with full honors. Some were buried in Arlington National Cemetery, others returned to their home states to be buried among family. A portion of the recovered crew cabin was later buried at sea, at a location that was deliberately not disclosed publicly, so it would never become a site sought out by the curious. The shuttle program itself was grounded for 32 months, while NASA redesigned the booster joints and restructured the way safety concerns were escalated and reviewed internally. Every crewed shuttle mission that flew afterward did so under procedures shaped directly by what investigators learned from Challenger. It's worth stepping back and asking why NASA chose the level of discretion it did throughout this entire process, because in the years since, that quiet has occasionally been mistaken for something more troubling. The truth, based on the public record, is more human than that. The people running the recovery and investigation were engineers, physicians, divers, and administrators who understood they were not just handling wreckage. They were handling what remained of 7 people whose families were watching, waiting, and grieving in real time. Every decision to keep cameras back, to notify families privately, to withhold a burial location, to describe medical findings in careful, measured language, was a decision that put the dignity of the dead and the privacy of the living ahead of public curiosity. That restraint is not something we see rewarded very often, and it's worth acknowledging directly. There's a broader reason this particular tragedy has stayed lodged in public memory in a way few others have. It wasn't uncovered years later through investigative reporting or leaked documents. It happened live on national television, in front of an audience that included some of the youngest and most impressionable viewers in the country, specifically because a teacher was on board and schools had built lesson plans around the launch. That combination, a national audience primed with hope watching a national tragedy unfold in real time, is part of why the image of the forking smoke trails has never really faded from American memory. But the fireball was never the whole story, and for decades it was the only part most people knew. The fuller story, the almost 3 minutes after the breakup, the quiet and painstaking 5-week search across hundreds of square miles of ocean, the divers who carried what they saw for the rest of their lives, and the decisions made specifically to protect 7 grieving families from further pain, deserves to be remembered too. Not because it makes the tragedy easier to sit with. It doesn't. But because understanding what actually happened and understanding the care that was taken afterward is its own form of honoring the people who died. Commander Dick Scobie, Pilot Michael Smith, Mission Specialists Judith Resnick, Ellison Onizuka, and Ronald McNair, Payload Specialists Gregory Jarvis and Krista McAuliffe. 7 names the world learned in a single afternoon in 1986, and 7 names still worth saying out loud today. If this history mattered to you, let me know in the comments which overlooked chapter of a well-known tragedy you'd want covered next, and consider subscribing so these stories keep getting told with the care they deserve.